Okay. All right, let's kick things off. Again, good to see you all. Welcome to our Gender Pay Parity in Product and Tech event. We're super excited to have all of you here to join this really important conversation. Can everyone see my screen okay? Cool. All right. So let's get started. We're gonna spend 10 minutes. Whoops, clicking way too many different buttons here. Let me hit %. So we're gonna spend the next 10 minutes doing land acknowledgement, product BC announcements, and I'm gonna start with some introductions of our speaker today, Leslie, as well as our panelists, Annika and Michelle. And then we're gonna go straight into a presentation prepared by Leslie. And very importantly, and one thing that we've mentioned as we promote the event is we want to take an extra focus on using the lens of product professionals, how product professionals as very influential people in various different organizations be the voice and play a role in moving the dial, no matter what job level they're in. So we'll have that presentation, and then we'll follow that with a panel discussion with a list of curated questions from the community. We have a backlog of questions that we're going to be going through. But if you have questions that you want us to cover, we potentially would have time for a couple of questions at the end. So feel free to pop those questions into the chat window. Throughout the event, if you have any technical challenges that you're facing, or if you have any questions in general, please pop them in the chat as well. Negar and myself would be monitoring the chat window. And thanks, Negar, for helping us today with the event as well. And before I start, just want to also quickly say hi to folks that I've not met in the past. My name is Timothy Young. I'm currently the president of the board at Product BC, and also at the events committee. And we do monthly events at Product BC. If this is your first event, please check out our website for more information of our organization and learn more about our events, our programs, and different initiatives that we're doing this year. We're doing a lot of work around the diversity, equity, and inclusion space in product management, product marketing, product operations, product design, and various different product disciplines. Negar, if you can continue to admit folks into the meeting room, that'd be great. Thank you. Okay, so I want to start with a land acknowledgement. It is very important for us to spend the time to actually think through it. And I'm gonna prepare some time for us to reflect as well after I go through the acknowledgement. But we really want to invite you to join us in acknowledging that this event, myself, Negar, and our speaker Leslie, and our panelists Annika and Michelle, we're all based in Vancouver. So the event is, while virtual, being hosted upon the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. This acknowledgement is really an opportunity for us to reflect and acknowledge the discriminatory, racist, and colonial practices that have had a lasting legacy and continue to create barriers for Indigenous people and communities in our city. If you are not Indigenous, we provide a moment now for you to consider what privileges you have on your land because of colonialism. We also suggest you consider what personal or organizational practices that are in place to work towards reconciliation. So now I'm gonna take a quick have a minute pause for us to reflect. Okay, now moving to announcements. Product BC, we have launched our new podcast at the end of March. We actually already have 2 episodes with a third coming in a few days. So if you want to check out podcast.productbc.ca, we have the links to your favorite podcast platforms such as Spotify and Apple Podcasts for you to check out a couple of our episodes. It's actually featured as one of the guests in our first episode. And then our second episode was with Eric Bin, head of product at Article, which is a fast-growing e-commerce organization based in Vancouver. And he talks a lot about building a diverse and inclusive team as well, a diverse and inclusive product team. So check them out. For upcoming events, we are about to announce our May event early next week. So please do check our communications, whether if you were signed up for our newsletter or if you are following us on LinkedIn, or this is going to go on to our website as well. So please keep a close eye. We'll also make sure to announce it on meetup.com. If you're not a member on our meetup group, please join us as we will post all kinds of information about events throughout the year on the platform. In June, we're actually going to have a virtual networking event, which is our regular product brew event in a virtual format. We'll announce some changes in terms of the interactive sections we're trying to do in the event, so stay tuned for that. And we're also going to have our annual general meeting for Product BC members on the 22nd of June. A plug for this as well, we have opened the registration process for folks who want to run as board members this term at Product BC. So we're going to be sending out an email to our mailing list over the next few days, but also feel free to check out our website and select announcement on the process on how to apply to run for the board. All right, without further ado, I'm gonna do a quick intro of our speaker today and our 2 other panelists. So Leslie, super happy to have you here. Leslie's the VP of People and Culture at Unbounce, and she leads people strategies, social impact, and DEI initiatives and workplace culture at Unbounce. She's been with Unbounce since 2014 and has since seen the rise of, the massive growth that Unbounce has undergone, from growing from 40 employees to nearly 200 across Canada and into Europe as well. And a lot of you probably remember the last round of funding. I think it was around, can't remember, Leslie, maybe around 45 million, or I think I'm close, right, Leslie?
52.
52.
Yeah.
Off by a few million.
There. Last number.
Yeah, and then but Leslie, has been a speaker in this space for many years as well, and she is committed to championing diversity and inclusion across the whole tech sector. And Unbounce 2 years ago was able to achieve gender pay parity, which is super amazing. And Leslie and her team have worked very hard towards that. And I think that process started in 2017 when you signed the pledge with Minerva Foundation, right?
Correct.
So, yeah, love to hear more about the journey in the presentation. But welcome, Leslie. Thanks for joining us today. And we have Annika as well. Annika is the co-founder at Talent Collective, and she is a global remuneration professional. And I know Annika has done a lot of work with Unbounce and many other companies on pay parity and a lot of different initiatives around human resources and people practice. And I know a lot of you on the call actually know Annika as well, probably have worked together in many different settings. So we're super excited to have Annika as one of our panelists joining us today. Thank you, Annika, for joining us. And we have Michelle, who's a partner at EY and People Advisor Services Consulting. And Michelle has had a long, illustrious, very successful career at EY South Africa before moving to the beautiful North Vancouver. A plug there because I really love North Vancouver. I live in Vancouver, but North Vancouver is just so amazingly beautiful. And she leads our people advisory services here, but she also, is a known DEI leader, very well known within the EY networks and as well as outside of EY. So thank you for joining us today as a panelist, Michelle. I look forward to hearing your thoughts and your thought leadership around, pay parity, especially from an overall DEI and people practice angle. Without further ado, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and I will hand it over to Leslie to take us through the presentation.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to start sharing my screen. Can everyone see my screen all right?
Yep.
Amazing. All right. So welcome, everybody. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you for attending. Thank you for inviting me. I don't work in the product space. I work in the people and culture space. And I know that my two co-panelists that we're going to have a chat with and answer some questions later also work in the people space. But I know I speak for all of us in saying that we are thrilled and excited to have the opportunity to chat with you a little bit more today about the gender wage gap and some inequities that exist very, very concretely in our professional lives still to this day. So what we're going to talk about today is a little bit about Unbounce's journey to pay parity and gender parity at the company, while also hoping to provide you as an individual, regardless of where you sit in your organization, with some tools, some tricks, some resources to actually create change in this area, even if you're not in the people and culture space, even if you're not a senior leader or a manager. How can you start today in your career driving change in this area? Because really, at the end of the day, we will have the opportunity to create change in our workplaces when we all have an active voice. So with that, hi, Timothy did a wonderful job of introducing me, so I'm not going to do much more, but I'm Leslie. My pronouns are she, her, and if you're interested in connecting with me, I'm Lessimatron on all social, and feel free to email me as well or connect on LinkedIn. So Unbounce, in case you're not familiar, I'll just give you a very brief overview of who we are. We are the leading landing page platform for marketers around the world. We are time and time again have been named one of Canada's fastest growing tech companies. We've been recognized as one of Canada's most admired corporate cultures for multiple years in a row. We are extremely serious about having a people first culture. And when I say people first, that means that all of our strategy is derived from, we believe fundamentally at the core of our philosophy that if we support our employees or our people, they will then in turn create great products and support our customers in finding success through our offering, which will then in turn create business value, which leaves me with a wonderful opportunity as the head of people and culture at Unbounce to make great impact for our customers and our people. We are absolutely proud as well to really prioritize diversity, equity, empathy, and inclusion in everything we do, and continue that work today beyond the walls of Unbounce with these types of conversations. So we've grown a little bit, actually quite a bit in the last little while. We're growing very, very rapidly. So we're actually 235 people now. So I've been lucky enough to oversee a net increase of employees, about 200 over the last 7 years in different waves of growth for us, and usually happening in big spurts of 50 to 100 at any given time. We have over 16,000 customers, and our landing pages, through our customers' landing pages on our platform, have helped facilitate over 1 billion conversions in the time that we have been in operation. So we really do strive to create better success for our customers, and they have realized that to the tune of 1 billion conversions through our product. Now, why we're here today and what kind of makes me uniquely positioned to talk about this is we've actually gone through the journey as an organization, a small to medium-sized business, which I know many of you work for, of analyzing and recognizing we don't know how we pay or if we pay fairly. We don't have the data. Moving through getting the data of do we pay fairly, recognizing how we could create a process and structure around this to commit to paying fairly across all employee groups, regardless of how they show up at work, regardless of their self-identified demographic information. And then we thought, hey, this is something that we know most companies are aware that there's a gender gap. Most of us as humans who live and operate in the world today know that there's a gender wage gap, and they want to minimize it or do work to minimize it, but maybe don't know where to start or don't know how to prioritize the work, or it seems like this big thing to undertake. So how could we share our story, encourage others to take a pledge to work alongside us in starting to close that pay gap? Now, I know that you all here are not people and culture professionals, but I'll give you a little bit of a grounding of why this is important to all of us. At Unbounce, we have a whole bunch of values. As I mentioned, we're very people first, and our values are here: courage, ambition, being real, empathy, and diversity. And they stand for to be cared for. And that's where that people first mentality comes into play for us. We really want to care for our people. And when we say care for our people, we mean care for all our people. And that means that we need to be very confident in saying that we care for people by treating them equitably when they come to work. And one of the things that joins us all in why we come to work is that we get a paycheck when we come to work and do work for an organization. So, so it's extremely important for us to make sure that we are committed to actually caring for our employees through action and how we operate, not just in our culture and how we have conversations or our leadership styles, but how do we pay, and being able to stand confidently behind that. So let me talk to you a little bit about the landscape. So you're probably aware that there's a wage gap, there's a gender wage gap, there's lots of different wage gaps for many individuals in Canada and across the globe. So let me just ground it really quickly in some data, so we're all on the same page before we get going. So in Canada, women make 92 cents on average for every $1 made by a man. This is after you account for differences in industries, occupations, seniority levels, part-time versus full-time work. And what's more important than this to acknowledge is that this gap does not acknowledge the unique struggles faced by different groups of women. So this would include racialized women or trans women, women living with disabilities, any age discrimination that happens in the wage gap. These individuals face even a larger pay gap. And what that looks like, I have a little bit of data. There's still not as much data in these areas as we would like, but I do have some. The gender pay gap is definitely not equal for all women. And these are startling numbers. And I think the most important thing to acknowledge and recognize here is that when we talk about closing the pay gap, when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives, they have to be inclusive, and they have to account for intersectionality. And what I mean by that is that it is all well and fine for us to acknowledge that there's a 92-cent pay gap between women and men, but what about racialized women who are making 67 cents on the dollar? How do we then put extra additional effort into focusing on that gap as well? So you can see the numbers here. Women living with a disability in Canada make an average of 50 cents on the dollar when compared to earnings of non-disabled men. So that's 46% pay gap, which is startling. So there's a lot of opportunity for change. So hopefully at this point we agree. Something has to change. We need to be able to do something about this. And how do we actually make change as a wider society, as a country, as a province, as a city, wherever you may be? How do we actually, as a company, as a team, even the team that you work on, how do you make change? Well, I'm gonna share what we were able to do and hopefully provide you with a couple of tips and tricks. First off, I need to take a note. Timothy mentioned that we took all of this kicked off with us as we were going through our growth stage a few years ago, back in 2016. we signed a pledge to combat gender inequities within our workplace. We recognize working in technology in particular, there was a significant lack of representation of women in our technical roles and in our workforce overall. And we really had a big gap to fill in that area. So we took this pledge and we've been working on it diligently, step by step, making progress ever since. And what's really important to know about this is that this work takes a long time. There is no way in which we create culture change and systemic change in these areas by snapping our fingers and saying we're going to do differently tomorrow. So the first ask of all of you is with an eye to diversity, equity, inclusion, knowing that your voice matters and having patience and being contributing to progress over perfection. If we hold our holding our employers accountable is extremely important as employees. As people that show up to work every day, it's very important to hold our employers accountable and our companies accountable. It's also important to allow companies to take step-by-step progress towards change. So we continue our journey. We continue to, take an intersectional lens of how we are actively fighting racism within our own processes, within how we show up in support of our communities, internally at Unbounce and externally. And it's an ongoing journey. And I hope today can perhaps be a start of that journey for you too. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to go over all of the details of how to close the pay gap, because I think that if you're interested, you can search Unbounce Pay It for Progress. There's a pledge that your company can take, but there's also a toolkit if you're fascinated or interested to learn more about the nitty-gritty details of how to create pay parity or pay band or those sorts of things. But I do really want to talk about a few key pieces that will help elevate your ability to make change. And click forward. There we go. The first thing I want to talk about is why it's important to take a pledge. So I talked about we took that Minerva pledge to advance the role and participation of women at the workplace. And then we also created this Pay It for Progress initiative where we ask companies to take a pledge alongside us and start making progress to close that gender pay gap. And why that's important in particular is that we know, and it is backed in a lot of really solid research, that it's critical to set intention, commitment, and long-term priorities against diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives in order to ensure they're successful. One of the single most important factors is if the CEO and senior leadership team, most important factors in seeing long-term success of any diversity, equity, inclusion initiative is through CEO commitment, time dedicated towards it, visibility for themselves and their senior leadership team. So with that, what does that mean for you? First of all, I'll ask, do you know what your company's stance is on actively closing the gender wage gap? Has your company ever talked about a wage gap? Have you ever talked about salaries at all at the company level? Is there a prioritization of diversity, equity, inclusion holistically, potentially culturally, or in hiring or other ways? And if the answer to any of these is no, or I'm not sure, or hey, that's a good question, I ask you, who can you ask? And the reason I ask that is what I said earlier, which is every employee's voice matters. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes here. So who can you ask? Next, the steps are pretty straightforward from there, and step by step, you calculate your unadjusted pay gap. So I'll talk a little bit just out of interest what an unadjusted pay gap is. That is the average gap between a woman's salary and a man's salary within a company. Now, the reason why, you may be wondering, you just said, Leslie, it's really important to account for intersectional lenses of diversity when you are initiating diversity, equity, inclusion projects. Why are we only talking about women and men's salary? That binary gender definition is not inclusive. Well, when I talk about progress over perfection, a lot of companies have already. They ask you when you start, you probably are aware of this. They take a bit of a census and they ask you for your gender, and they have your salary. So without doing any work whatsoever, a company can start analyzing their pay gap on the gender binary of the average woman's salary to the average man's salary. And that's a starting point. So this is the first step because it's usually something that can be done quite quickly. And it's a start and something to measure over time. It's really important to note as well, this does not tell a full story. Obviously, an average salary between genders is going to be impacted by representation at the company. If you have more men in higher, more senior positions, or more women in the executive team, that's going to skew the average between different groups of genders. So just something to keep in mind there as well. But with that, just to let you know, we ran our first gender pay gap analysis back in 2017, and we did find we went not just an overall like gender analysis at the highest level of the company, but we went line by line, job by job, level by level to analyze if there was a gap. And we did find that in a couple, I think it was 3 instances across the company, so 3 individuals, there were women in roles where they were under earning versus their male counterparts. So we were in a financial position where we were able to take action immediately and continue a process in place in order to account for that not happening again. And I'm happy to say that it hasn't. So again, are you a senior leader? Amazing. You have a lot of ability to impact change in your organization. And I would encourage you that as a senior leader, it is all of our responsibilities to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. But grassroots employee interests matter and create change. So the reason I say this, maybe through the participants or the reactions tab, I'm just wondering, hands up, if you can raise your hand. I think that's an option available to you. Please, someone correct me if I'm wrong.
It is.
Let me know. Yeah, okay, great, thanks. Let me know if you remember a few years back when an employee at Uber wrote a pretty scathing blog post about the treatment of women working at Uber. Does anyone remember that? Yeah.
Yeah.
Quite a few of you, right? So that was a few years ago now. Thank you so much. You can put your hands down. That's awesome. So that was quite a while ago now, and we still remember that. And I'm willing to bet that some of you who raised your hands would also think twice about, or that would come to mind when or if you considered, you heard a news article about Uber and their culture, or they're hiring here, or they're looking for people in your area, or maybe make you take pause for a moment. I really want to highlight that was one person's voice. So when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives, when it comes to pay parity, your voice matters. So if you take nothing away from today, I really, really encourage you to consider how much power you have. The landscape has shifted dramatically in the last 10 years with power dynamics at organizations, and employees have lots of tools at their disposal with Glassdoor, with social media to hold their employers accountable. I encourage you to start with internal conversations, obviously, but your voice does matter. So if this is important to you, start the conversation with whoever you have contact with in your organization, including your manager if that's first. So again, not getting into the nitty-gritty details, but the next step is defining a pay policy and how transparent you want to be with your people about it. So a pay policy in very simple terms is if you decide how you want to pay as an organization. So not every company is going to fall in the same place from a market perspective. You may want to lead, you may want to lag, you may want to meet the market. Salary expectations change for company size, for location. So it's up to the company to really decide how you want to pay and why that's important. And then creating some transparency and structure around it is it removes the requirement for negotiation capability and confidence, as well as other systemic unseen biases in the interview process. If you know what a role is worth before someone comes through the door, they're going to be offered what's fair for the role. And that's drastic. That's very, very important. We don't want to rely on individuals' abilities to negotiate or requests for salary as being the benchmark or the determining factor of how somebody gets paid coming into your organization. Now, pay transparency is how visible each part of pay is to employees and potentially even the outside world. And I have a bit of a visual to represent that. So we don't talk a lot about pay. Companies don't talk a lot about pay. I'm sure very few companies actually have company-wide meetings where they talk about how we pay bands, salary bands, and those sorts of things. I'm a firm believer that we should talk more about it. I think it's really important. But this is the spectrum of pay transparency that we've sourced from Glassdoor and Bamboo HR, Glassdoor and Bamboo HR report. It goes all the way on the left-hand side from paycheck visibility. So here's your pay stub, and you know what your deductions are, and your gross earnings, your net earnings, all the way open to WOE, which we called open salary or published ranges, and even sometimes published salaries of individuals in roles at the company. The most famous example of this is Buffer. I don't know if any of you have heard of Buffer, but they have a very open published individual salaries, or I actually don't know if they still do that, but they have in the past. So if you're interested, I encourage you to look up Buffer and see what their dramatically transparent strategy is. It's wonderful in many ways, but very few companies choose to go all the way to that level of transparency. So you will probably fall somewhere between 1 and 4. At Unbounce right now, we fall in the Y. So we've done multiple sessions with people leaders and managers on here's why we pay like we do, here's the market data and salary information and how we build our salary band so you have the information, and here's where you sit on that salary band and what the potential is for your growth in your career. So I encourage you to get curious about your company's salary transparency. On that spectrum, where does your company fall when you look at it? Do you only get a paycheck and you have absolutely no visibility into what you would make if you've been in your role for an additional 3 years, or if you're new to the role and developing? What about when you're fully proficient? What about when you're the expert on the team? What is your upwards earning potential? If you don't know, it's worth asking. It is also worth noting that a lot of companies, especially if they're smaller, haven't taken the time to do a lot of work around this. So don't fret. That doesn't mean you're working for a bad company that doesn't have a great HR team. It just means that there's work to be done. And it means that it's worth asking the question, because your voice and more voices like yours as employees do create priorities for people and culture teams and HR teams to focus on these sorts of initiatives. So the next couple of steps are very detail oriented around the nitty gritty of leveling your employees and getting market data. So I'm not going to talk about those, but I do believe that we don't talk enough about pay bands. And what a pay band is. So I'm sure all of you at some point have looked up salary for my job title, and you go to Glassdoor or you go to payscale.com, and it gives you that lovely graph with an average and a lower end and an upper end. In many ways, that is like a salary band. There's a lot of reasons why that's not super reliable, and I'll get into that in a moment. But I truly believe that pay band literacy and understanding how pay bands work is absolutely crucial for each and every one of you, for me, for every worker, understanding what fair means and how pay is actually determined. So my question to you is, do you know? Do you know how a pay band is created? Do you know what the different areas of pay band are and why you may fall in one area or another? It's not something we talk about a lot, but I'm going to give you a crash course. Don't worry. So this is a pay band. You can see it's a lower end on the left, upper end on the right, with more earnings, with a midpoint in the middle here. Let's use $100. Nobody makes $100 salary, but let's say there's an annual salary of $100 as the midpoint here, right in the middle. So that midpoint is what we call our pay policy target. And this is determined by that pay philosophy that I talked about before, or that pay policy, and how, if you want to meet, lead, or lag the market. And what is the market data telling you about what it means to meet, lead, or lag the market for your size company in your specific industry and in your specific area? With that information, you can set a target in the middle. Means you know exactly what you combine all those pieces around philosophy and target, and voila, you have your midpoint. So what does the midpoint mean, you might be asking me? Well, that's where you are 100%, you're earning 100% in the proficiency zone. So as you move through any career or any salary band, you usually start in the developing zone. So you're new to the job, you're still learning, you're growing, you need additional support. You haven't seen enough situations haven't yet passed your desk for you to be kind of standing on your 2 feet and fully proficient. So you move up to that proficiency zone from development, and then as you stay in that role a little bit longer, you end up in the mastery zone, where you're really that leader for your peers within your discipline. Now, how long it takes to go from one end to the other, from proficient to mastery, from developed to proficiency, varies from person to person, from job to job, and from career to career. So I don't have a good answer for that. But how the lower and upper bands are determined, it's based on that midpoint that we set, that $100. You take a certain percentage, in this case, and how we approach it, it's an 80% to 120%. So 20% low, or $80 a year. This person's sorely underpaid, definitely not pay equitable. $80 a year all the way up to $120 a year for the end of that mastery zone and the beginning of that development zone. So it's really important when you're having career conversations to understand, are you developing? Are you still more like junior or entry level into this, not maybe in your career, but into this career level? Are you absolutely proficient? Are you, going through the motions? You are standing on your own 2 feet? Or are you the recognized expert for your peers within this discipline? So understanding that is also a very important piece to understand where pay should be coming from for you in your role. So last thing, what we do is we analyze our data. And you're probably not going to be doing this. Somebody on your comp team, your exec team, your finance team is going to be doing that, but I'll just share really quickly what we found at Unbounce. So this is this year's findings. So at the end of 2020, beginning of 2021, we did a pay gap analysis, and this is an adjusted gender pay gap analysis. So we did discover when we look at level to level, we compare apples to apples. So job, the same department, the same level of experience, so junior, intermediate, senior, the same managerial level. We did find that there is an unadjusted pay gap of 17.7%, which is the average salary of men versus the average salary of women. That overall disparity vanishes when we adjust for department and level. There is no impact on salary that is created by either gender and tenure, which is a celebration moment for us, because those practices that we put in place that I've just gone through a few years ago have worked for us. They've actually worked in ensuring that we are maintaining a equitable pay environment within our company. What does impact pay is department, managerial status, and level or seniority level, which are all things that you would expect to impact. So interesting findings for us, and we continue to do the work. My hope for Pay Up for Progress, my hope for all of you and for pay parity moving forward, is that everybody has knowledge and understanding of where their unadjusted pay gap is, and if they've run an adjusted pay gap, to compare those roles apples to apples, because really there should be no difference. If you do dive deep and look that one person's doing 2 people are doing the same role, they should, and operating at the same level, they should be making the same amount of dollars. It is worth noting that we did run different views for intersectionality this year as well around the gender pay gap. We don't have time. I don't have time today to go into all of the different findings, but what we do know is that we unfortunately are working on getting some more quality and more volume in our self-represented, our self-identified data from our employees in order to continue bringing validity up in that data around the pay gap with different intersectionalities, taking into account things like race, age, ethnicity, and those pieces as well. So to wrap up, I hope you are inspired to have your voice heard and make equal pay a priority at your company. I encourage you, no matter where you sit, to take one action item away from today, even if it's asking a question. So I'll just do a really quick recap of what you could potentially do. So first is focus. So get curious. Do you know somebody on your people and culture team, your HR team? What about your manager? Do you have a relationship with a founder, a CEO, a senior leader? Who could you book a coffee chat with, or would they be open to a coffee chat to discuss some of these things? They don't have to be big questions, very specific about pay parity, but questions to, or answers to questions like, what are your commitments and our commitments around diversity, equity, and inclusion? Is anyone focusing on it? Is there an opportunity for us to focus more? How can I help? If you know that you are, have we calculated gender pay gap? Can we? Do we have the information? What about beyond just gender? Can we look into our racialized employees and other marginalized groups, and how can we be certain that we are paying everybody equitably? Show of hands. Again, hands up, reaction of some sort. How many of you have been involved with a hiring process in your career of hiring somebody? Right? Lots of you. Yeah, most of you actually. So this is our biggest opportunity to make a difference. How much information, if you're a hiring manager, if you are the decision maker for hiring, how can you do the work up front to ensure that you know the answers to these questions? Download the toolkit of Unbounce Pay It for Progress and take a stab at creating a pay band. Run it by your HR person if they haven't been able to do it for you. But really, what I want to stress more than anything is use your voice whenever and whatever way you can. Asking questions, we talked about the Uber example, is really the most important and impactful way to us to create change in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. And if your CEO or your people and culture teams or your HR teams or comp teams, if you have them, are interested or have done a lot of this work already, we are always looking for more to join us in pledging to prioritize pay parity. We have a great community going over Slack on an ongoing basis, and we'll be kicking off a second cohort with learning sessions and conversations in the fall again. So take a look. And with that, that is everything that I have for you today. So thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to continuing the discussion. Feel free to connect with me on social, LinkedIn, emails. I can't see what's going on in the chat right now, so hopefully we get to some really good questions in the panel.
We did.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for the great presentation, Leslie. I'm amazed at how you're able to pack so much information into 30 minutes of presentation. I know this has been an initiative that you've been working at Unbounce with for quite a few years, and have signed up a lot of companies in the tech industry to join the pledge as well. So definitely super exciting to see the progresses, as well as how you're able to package up a lot of those next actions for us to contemplate and think about how we can be a part and take part like literally tomorrow. With that, thanks again, Leslie. We will now jump into our panel discussion, and I see a lot of great activities going on in the chat already. So we're going to be adding the questions to the backlog, and we'll find our backlog and prioritize the questions on the backlog, and we'll see how things go from a timing perspective. So we have Leslie, Annika, and Michelle on camera here. So great, we can get started. Not gonna be sharing my screen so we can just keep this format. Maybe let me just start with the list of curated questions, and just want to quickly level set for these questions because some of these questions are highly specific, and it really speaks to some of the key expertise that Leslie, Annika, and Michelle have. So I'm probably gonna go by calling for specific panelists to respond to certain questions, also from a timing perspective too, because we want to make sure we can go over as many questions as possible. So that's the format we're going to be taking. So let me start with the first question from our list that's curated from our community. So you've talked about this in the presentation, but we're wondering if you can shed a bit more light in how does pay transparency relate to efforts to eventually achieve pay parity in individual organizations and as an industry as a whole. Is there something else you want to add to what you were sharing earlier, Leslie, around pay transparency, since this is a well voted questions amongst our community?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there was actually a similar question in the chat around how public was this made within the organization when we made these pledges and did this work as well. So I'll just add a little bit more context around transparency. I'm going to be honest, talking about pay is often still very a taboo subject at many companies and very difficult to chat about. My goal, and I hope everyone kind of like lifts the curtain or pulls the curtain apart. I know my fellow panelists probably have that same goal in mind for the world. But what that actually looks like is we cannot make change unless we have everybody enabled to advocate for their own pay. And in order to do that, it requires understanding. So it starts with an understanding of how pay works and what pay bands are and where am I in my performance level within a certain pay band. But it also, from a transparency perspective, there's no wrong answer in my mind of where transparency lies. I think there is a lot of benefit and I think we should be moving towards more transparency. I actually personally believe that the WOE model or the buffer model is too much. I think I look at pay, this is my own perspective. There's lots of people that have a different perspective, but I believe that pay data and how much I make is actually a personal choice to share or not to share, and share as much as you want, of course, if that you're interested in doing so. But I do believe that that's an individual choice versus the choice of a company to make for each other. But my perspective is that transparency is really the key to unlocking pay being a taboo subject, and then the power dynamics that come up with not knowing how to advocate for yourself, not understanding what equal pay actually means or what the value of a role is within a company. If you have recruiters that can talk very confidently about pay, hiring managers that can talk very confidently about pay, and on the other side of the table, candidates that can ask really powerful questions about pay, we're starting to kind of lift that curtain. We're starting to bring the playing field to a more even and level place. And as far as the question of how, starting in 2016, how public was this made within the organization? Very public. We dedicated time at our town halls. Our CEO dedicated time in AMAs, and through every step of our process, we were very, very transparent. I will tell you that when we first started years ago, when we did a pay audit, we didn't even think to be transparent about it because we were just in our own processes. But as soon as it became part of an actual project and initiative, we were transparent about the timelines. We were transparent about what we found, and we were transparent about every piece of the process. And even this year, we've undertaken a whole series of events to talk about compensation very openly with all of our employees. And our goal is to eventually have very open, widely available pay bands for every single role, and have them posted very widely on our job descriptions as well. We just firmly believe that that's a journey that we want to bring our people along with us on.
Awesome. Thank you, Leslie. Next question, I'm gonna ask Michelle to help with answering it. How can we shape job descriptions to help close the gender pay gap?
Hey, so we all know job descriptions is a really boring document that we often hold in the people space that really describes the role that exists in the organization. And we know that in any job description, and whatever you use, whether it's a job description or a job advert that is used to advertise a role, the words used in that job description makes a massive difference to the kind of candidates that you either attract or repel for that particular role. So for instance, we know that research tells us things like that certain words and job titles that are used in job descriptions or job adverts often have a gender bias, so either associated with one or other gender. And so that automatically then has people deciding whether or not to apply for the role. We also know that, for instance, when we look at the list of requirements of a role, that in fact, only 60% of women would apply for a role if they, women basically would only apply for a role if they meet 100% of the requirements. Whereas with men, most of them would apply even if they meet 60% of those requirements of the role. So even in that, it's about thinking about clearly about what are those requirements? Is it actually needed when you are, putting the role description together at the end of the day? And ultimately, what it tells us is that by thinking about the words that we use in a job description and how that comes across to candidates that are reading it, really determines the candidate pool that ultimately determines around which of the people you can attract into the organization. So that in itself, by having less diverse people being attracted into your organization, impacts pay parity and pay equity significantly. So we really need to think about that in terms of being able to attract a much more diverse candidate pool into the organization in order to meaningfully address pay equity in the workplace ultimately. The last thing that I would say about this is that it's really important in job descriptions to also think about really bringing across the kind of culture that you are trying to create. We find that by really describing that, so being clear about having or being committed to things like a diverse and inclusive culture, by being committed to pay parity, for instance, really is going to be able to attract a very different set of candidates that really allows organizations to meaningfully address issues around diversity in the workplace, but also pay equity ultimately.
Thank you, Michelle. For the next question, I'm going to ask Annika to help with answering. What are the challenges around achieving pay parity that are specific to the technology industry, and how do we go about to tackle these challenges?
Yeah, interesting question, especially looking at some of the things that have already come up in the conversations. I think the challenge we have in tech, and quite frankly, any industry that has STEM-focused roles, is the fact that we have a challenge of proportion, or like a challenge around the proportion between women and men that are in these roles to begin with, which then becomes a representational challenge. So I saw Leslie was answering some questions around that, and I think that is a huge factor that kind of plays into why are we seeing these challenges in tech or in STEM. Compared to, for example, retail, right? Now, with that combined with, less women in higher tier positions, basically brings down that unadjusted gap, right? So the average or the median pay figures between men and women become much lower if we're seeing women in much lower ranking type of roles. So I think that's, again, nothing new. We've seen this many times. The question is, though, again, what can we do about it? And it's not, what I find very interesting is like it's very known, and to Leslie's point, it's it's like, how can we make progress in this area? And one area that I find is something that all of us can do, and including you on the call here, is actually quite simple, and quite frankly is not just directed towards women per se, but towards all employees. And that is really focusing on proper career pathing and proper career development. I just saw a recent survey from Women in Tech. They did a survey with women in tech in the US, and these women indicated that 66% felt one barrier to getting promoted was a clear path forward. So in my opinion, kind of looking at career pathing and career development and how we can, create better conversations around this is something that is foundational and quite frankly shouldn't be something we look at from, oh, I'm a big organization and we should have this versus I'm a small organization, I don't need to have this. Right? I actually just recently worked with a company with 10 employees and we built out a full career development and a career pathing type of strategy for them because they felt that this was super important to them. Role clarity, what Michelle just talked about, identifying competencies, making sure that everything is leveled properly, identifying cross-functional opportunities, especially in small organizations, is super important. Now, that being said, I am a big believer that we're all in charge of our own careers. However, there is some groundwork to be done, and that is up to the organization to lay that groundwork. And I feel that there can be a real big change there. So with that, thinking about all of you in product departments, what are you doing to clearly identify career paths for your employees, and or again, using Leslie's phrase from earlier, who can you ask about career pathing? Often when I bring this up with smaller organizations, I get the Annika, but we're so small, we don't need a senior product manager. Well, then I'm going to say that this is actually quite short-sighted. And it is your role as an organization to look at where employees can grow to, and you shouldn't be holding people back just because you might not have that opportunity. So really think about the ecosystem as overall and how can we grow and develop women in particular. And if that means they're going to graduate into a different organization, they're still contributing to the ecosystem and you're contributing to the ecosystem. So I do find, again, career development and career pathing can have a really huge impact, and it really isn't that big of a change. It's just you need to make it a priority, as Leslie mentioned.
Thank you, Annika. For the next one, I'm going to invite both Leslie and Michelle to help with this question. Very interesting one. How does COVID-19 affect pay gap and efforts towards achieving pay parity in the industry? Who wants to go first?
Go for it, Leslie.
Oh, we're both guys. Okay, sure. So dramatically. I mean, I think some of the data that there's tons of articles out there if you want to take a look at how COVID has impacted women dramatically, disproportionately to others. It's quite a bleak outlook, you can say, of the dent in progress made and that sort of thing. So when you look at pay parity, I mean, I have some stats that I pulled up from McKinsey. If you're interested in learning more about how COVID has impacted women in the workplace, McKinsey has done a wonderful overall global report on the state of women in the workplace and how that's changed as a result of COVID. Some really staggering facts. Women's jobs are 1.8 times more vulnerable as a result of COVID-19. And even though women comprise 39% of the workforce globally, 54% of the job loss due to COVID has been experienced by women. So just even right at that's globally, so right at the highest level, there's a deeper impact. Their predictions say that by 2030, if we take no action to try and correct these impacts to women's participation in the workplace, it would have a $1 trillion lower global GDP impact than if we stayed on track from post-pandemic numbers. The hopeful part is, though, if we take action now, as we're still going through the pandemic, we will have the opportunity to increase global GDP by between 5 and 13 trillion by 2030 in that same time frame, if we actually take action moving forward. So this is why ensuring equitable pay is when we're re-engaging and have a recovery plan that's inclusive for women. It absolutely needs to include checking that box of knowing every organization, are we paying women fairly? Because if, you know, women are disproportionately losing a year of experience, a year of salary increase, even if it's a cost of living increase of 1%, 2%, 3%, those sorts of things, that compounded over multiple women over multiple years of a career is a significant gap. So yes, definitely having an impact. And I'll leave Michelle to add.
Yeah, so just to add on to that, I mean, we also know that besides the job losses, that almost a third of women have stepped away from their roles in order to play caregivers in the midst of the pandemic. And that's to look after elderly family, parents, as well as children. And we know, you know, that's kind of stepping away from the workforce for an extended period of time, which makes it even more difficult to step back into the workforce a little bit later on. And that has, as Leslie said, significant impact on the salary that you earn thereafter. So really thinking about that, and I mean, if you ask what can we be doing on, you know, to really start to curb this, is starting to ask really difficult conversations in our organization about what are we doing about flexible policies that take care of flexible time commitments. So it allows our employees to go and play the role that they need to play with their families, and still allows them to be productive when they need to be productive. So they don't step away from the workforce. So you don't start to lose that. And, you know, this for me is ultimately a society issue. You know, if we don't address this, and as Leslie says, if we don't address it quickly, this is a significant impact for all of us from an economic perspective. So really starting to think about that. And then for all our men out there, certainly from an allyship perspective, really starting to talk up about these things in the workplace is exceptionally critical. And us having those allyship opportunities, mentorship opportunities. So it really does give not only women, but the minorities as well, because they are just as impacted by the pandemic around these things specifically, the opportunity to grow in the workplace despite the difficulties and the challenges that they're facing out there.
Absolutely. Can I just add one thing before we move on to anything? Build on Michelle, wonderfully put, could not put it better myself. That is amazing. To build on that, these types of issues are often viewed as women's problems or HR's problems to solve. And like Michelle said, this is everyone's problem. So we all have a voice, we all have a part to play, and it's really critical that we do. And as it's coming up, it's also very intertwined with all other pieces of career growth, engagement. What is your culture saying, and how is your culture inviting, you know, marginalized groups into the company? Pay is not a standalone issue. It is intertwined very deeply with other areas and focuses around how you invite in marginalized groups and how you ensure that they feel welcomed. And we're having a lot of structure, process, and policy around creating that progress towards betterment for all.
Thank you, Leslie and Michelle. The next one, I would like to ask Annika and Michelle to help answer. And admittedly, this question is from myself, and maybe that's why it is so long. I felt like I rambled on a little bit, but it's from a personal experience. So I do want to share it here. So some of my female colleagues and friends have expressed in the past that they felt they haven't negotiated as much as they would like in terms of salary and their pay package, overall package early on in their career. And it has a cascading effect. And potentially it might have been because they didn't feel encouraged or supported to negotiate as much as they should, given that, you know, negotiations very much influence the package at a lot of organizations. And where some male colleagues were maybe a bit more aggressive in asking for, say, higher pay. So how can we create an environment that would encourage our female colleagues to feel supported that way and be able to, you know, do so and negotiate in those situations?
I'm happy to jump in, Michelle.
Go for it.
Go. So it's interesting. I love how Leslie mentioned earlier, it's like, talking about pay, just even in the workplace from a manager perspective, let alone from the employee perspective, it's awkward. People don't love it. We often run when we do comp work with companies. I often run a survey asking folks like, how comfortable are you talking to your manager about compensation? Let's just say these stats are not great, right? And therein lies the challenge, right? Because I think as a society, talking about money, period, is just not something that we do, and it's just not normalized. And so it's trying to figure out ways that we can normalize this. I found this really funny stat, which I have not shared with my husband, so this is going to be for dinner conversation today. And it talked about that actually there was a study that in the US, in 34% of couples, married or not, they found that both partners had no real idea how much the other person makes. So I think that really speaks to the fact that, talk about money requires trust, right? It's like we're not comfortable because it feels near and dear to our heart. It is about trust, and clearly a lot of trust. So it's figuring out how can we as individuals really create some of that trust. And again, it's like I think that goes for both men and women, in kind of putting ourselves out there more. And when I say that, it's not about running around next time you see all your friends and being like, hey, how much are you making? Let's talk about pay. That's not what I'm talking about. But what I am talking about is inviting some of these conversations. So maybe next time you are, with your friends or colleagues, you may want to say something like, hey, I've attended this session with Product BC, and we talked about the importance of engaging in meaningful conversation around pay. Is this something you're interested in? Right? Opening the door is like, hey, would you be willing to talk more about this? And then again, the second question is not, hey, how much you make? You want to follow up with something like, hey, do you feel your employer pays fairly? What is considered a pay range that's reasonable in your industry for your job? Where do you think you land? How does it make you feel? Right? Like open up with these conversations to build trust, to get to a point where we can, again, have more meaningful conversations around that. And for those that don't like, are not conversationalists, let's call it, there is, there are other opportunities in terms of sharing your insights. A couple of years ago, I started sharing a little spreadsheet in a group called Girl Gang. So if there are any Girl Gang members on here, feel free to say hi on chat. And it was really to invite women to just share anonymously how much they're making, where they're at in their career, etc., so that just there was more localized data available, because as we all know, there are the pay scales, etc., of the world. So we then opened that up, and I did a chat with women in product, and we used that as well. And so I thought, I was like, you know what, I'm just gonna dig out that survey or the spreadsheet, which literally anybody can contribute, and I'm just gonna throw it in chat. And if anybody feels like, hey, this is something where I feel comfortable sharing anonymously, and that might help others to kickstart conversations about it, it'll be there for you.
Yeah, I mean, I can't agree more, Annika. For me, this goes down to kind of that, it's about trust, and that goes down to the kind of culture that we're trying to create, both at a societal as well as at a workplace level. What is the kind of workplace that we are seeking to create, where people feel safe, whether it's women, minorities, everybody else feels safe to have the open, honest, tough conversations without feeling like if I have this conversation, like everything is on the line. It should be okay to have these conversations and to get the feedback that you need in order to address the questions that you have. It's also about education and awareness, right? So like Annika and Leslie spoke about, it's about getting the information that you need in order to go and have these conversations, and being as transparent as possible about it. We all know that, quite frankly, these conversations, and particularly when it comes to pay, it's like a black box. Nobody really wants to tell us how these things are calculated and how you take benefits into account and everything else that goes with it. It's crazy. So, it's really about creating those safe workplaces, and that we all need to feel that we can support and empower each other in order to be educated, aware, and go and have those tough conversations and know that someone's got your back out there and it's going to be okay.
Thanks for sharing. Let's do one more question from our curated list, and then we will have a few minutes to address one or two more questions from the chat. I saw that Leslie has been replying to a lot of the questions through the chat function as well, so thank you for that. This one is for Annika. So how can data help drive pay parity decisions? I know this is a pretty broad question, but maybe if there are some specific ideas around how it can directly influence, do you want to share some of your thoughts there?
Sure. I'm actually gonna turn this around and say something like, "Hey, data is great. However, use with caution." I think, again, obviously, the reason why we do pay audits or pay parity audits, the reason why, Leslie and her team and anybody who joined us on the journey of pay up for progress is doing this type of work. The analysis is clearly to use data inputs and get data outputs in order to make decisions. However, again, I think it's important to use caution when we apply this, especially when you're a smaller organization. And I think back, Hussein was saying hi earlier. It's like, I think back to work we did with 7 Geese, a very small organization at that point in time when we did some pay parity work there. And there was 35 of them. And it was really, great that they wanted to do this and kind of really dive in. However, we were really constricted in what we could do because of the sample size. Right, and is very different to be able to analyze data with 200 plus employees versus 35. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't. I'm just saying please use data with caution. So one of the things that obviously you can do at that point is, or sometimes the only thing you can do is look for that unadjusted pay gap. And I think somebody earlier was chatting about this, like, well, if you have the unadjusted pay gap, doesn't that give you some indication in terms of like some other challenges such as promotions, etc.? Yes, it may. However, again, if you only have 2 product managers, one is a woman and one is a man, and one makes more than the other, don't get to the conclusion that there is a pay gap here. What needs to happen is what Leslie and Michelle talked about earlier, is really looking at, do we have pay bands? Are we properly compensating folks for their job proficiencies? Is there a reason why there are these differences? Because one is in the mastery zone and the other one is in the development zone. So again, knowing the data is a good thing. However, you're going to have to dig a little deeper. Especially for smaller organization, one of the things that I recommend is doing something that I call just a simple job worth hierarchy. So basically listing your jobs from lowest paying to the highest paying, and then assigning are men or women in these jobs. Again, it shows you some trends. So the data will not be conclusive. However, you're likely going to see trends around the fact that, maybe you have more women in the lower level type of jobs. What's happening there, right? It's to get curious with data, I find, rather than using it for decision making, especially in a small organization. However, again, for large organizations where you can run a full set of analysis, I do find having the data can be very powerful when you go to your C-suite and be like, here's what it is. We did all the work. We did not only an unadjusted, but also an adjusted gap. And here's where we land. And here's what we need to do. It can be super powerful. So again, big fan of data, clearly crunch a lot of it. However, use with caution.
If I could just add on to that a little bit, there was a question just now around a little bit different type of data, but market data and how you get access to survey data and stuff. And I really really want to stress that, yes, these reports are not just available for free online. Maybe you can find a PDF of an older year's report from a few years ago, but salary surveys through companies like Mercer, Towers Watson, locally in BC, we have, in Alberta, we have the HR, and Yukon, we have the HR Tech Group, who runs technology company specific surveys. These are very rigorous surveys that take a lot of time to participate in. So if you participate as a company, you get a pretty big discount because it requires you to use a specific leveling system to make sure that you are reporting apples to apples. So at one company, you might be an intermediate or senior level, in an intermediate or senior level position. And at another company, you may be considering very early entry developing in your career. And those need to be accounted for because there's discrepancies that will show up. So the one thing I just always like to caution is that a lot of companies put out marketing tools that are salary surveys or salary reports based on self-reported data. And it's really, really tough because most of the time you cannot cut that data for company size, location, purchasing power within a certain location. There's a whole bunch of type of industry and those pieces that have a deep impact on what the salary range is, or they don't account for compensation philosophy or additional benefits like stock option, bonus programs, time off, paid time off, and those sorts of things. So just a word of caution as you're going out and looking, you can probably go out for any job at any level and find a data point online that says you could make either $40,000 in this job or $240,000 in this job. And I almost guarantee for every role you can find a data point for maybe not quite 40,000 for like C-suite roles, but definitely a very wide range. So a caution about those and do as much research as you can for yourself if you don't have access to, visible pay bands and that sort of thing for yourself.
And I think, Leslie, to your point, then also when you're talking to companies, ask about, hey, what's your compensation philosophy? Where are you getting your data from, right? And it's like having those types of conversations as part of the interview process so that you know where data is coming from, shows that you actually, have done your research and that you care about these pieces. So thank you for adding this on, Leslie.
Awesome. So before we wrap, let's take one more question from the audience. A lot of the questions are answered in the chat, so thank you, Leslie and Duncan, Kara, everyone else who are jumping in to help answer some of those questions. So and we will wrap in about 5 minutes. And also before you leave, if you can share some feedback with us through that SurveyMonkey link. I'm gonna post it again because it was kind of like hidden now with the sea of messages. Thank you for everyone's engagement. Here's the link. If you can share some feedback with us, that'll be great. So, okay, so question from Caitlin. I used to work together with Caitlin. Good to see you. How can maternity leave be factored into pay parity in a fair way? Who would like to take on the question? It's a very interesting question for sure.
Leslie, have you looked at, I was about to say, I was like, I'm sure in your analysis you would have looked at that and taken that on.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. So we look at women's salaries, particular women, because we have found at least, instead of saying how it impacts women on leave, it's the primary caregiver for a child over an extended period of time, and if it is having an impact on their salaries when they return. So there's a couple of things. First of all, really strong process about what it means to help somebody depart on that extended leave and what it means to help them come back. So we commit to a salary adjustment before they leave in anticipation of the salary adjustment that they would then receive while they're off. We do annual compensation adjustments, and it is very important from a career length of a career earnings potential of anyone who takes childcare leave. When you welcome new family members, that let's say that happens 2 or 3 times, compounded over the course of a year, that's a significant gap in earnings potential. So we proactively will adjust based on recent performance and assessments, just to make sure that we are not lagging behind. And then what then happens is those individuals then get captured in the assessment when we do salary adjustments and banding adjustments, so moving the bands as they need to, and they're in the right place at the same time, and we are counting for performance and where you sit on that band right when you go off on leave, instead of it being this big gap in time, and maybe there's a new manager in place, or you don't really remember how things were going when they were here previously. So we've done some work to do also spot checks on that and make sure that individuals from a career progression perspective have not lost out on opportunities. If there are roles, it's up to every manager to, as their people are on leave, to stay in contact with their people as much as they would like to stay in contact for new opportunities. And we actually offer the ability for those individuals to interview for those opportunities and then backfill for a mat leave, the portion of the mat leave or parental leave that they're taking. Just kind of holistically look at it, not just from a pay perspective, but also from an opportunity perspective as well.
Thank you, Leslie. Okay, Michelle, Anika, is there anything you want to add? If not, I think we can wrap for it.
No, Leslie captured it. It's really just about both those things, right? It's about thinking about that person has to constantly be considered when the organization is considering pay increases, bonus payouts, those kinds of things, and performance at the date of taking leave is obviously exceptionally important in taking that into account. And then in terms of ongoing development, as well as that ongoing communication with that individual for opportunities in the organization, but also other developmental opportunities, as they thinking of, getting ready to kind of come back into the organization and getting them ready to kind of take on that role again when they step back in. So kind of taking all of those into account in family policies is really, really important. So we see that a lot too.
Thanks for sharing. Okay, cool. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And again, thank you, Leslie, for the great presentation. Thank you, Anika, Michelle, Leslie, for the panel discussion. Loads of great questions today. And this is just a start in terms of, the wider conversation with the whole community as well. In the product basic community, on the Slack space, especially, we have lots of great conversations in the diversity inclusion channel and a few other places. So I encourage you to join us and, join us as a member, join us in the Slack community to continue with these conversations and interact with fellow tech professionals to see how we can together move the dial and play our part to start a movement here. And we'll be sharing out the video recording and a number of resources after this presentation as well. We'll send an email out. But yeah, for now, we'll wrap up for tonight. But again, thank you so much for the engaged discussions, questions, and coming tonight. This is a very important topic, and we're super glad that you're here. With that, I'm gonna wrap. And if you haven't had the chance to complete the NPS feedback survey, please do, and have a wonderful night, and we'll see you again soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming. Have a good night.